Okay, session 4 from chapter 10, Constructing Measurement Instruments. You might be wondering, when are we going to see the end of the tunnel with all this discussion of measurement instruments? Well, my first rule regarding constructing measurement instruments is let someone else do it. What I mean by that, it makes more sense to put your effort into finding a research instrument that has already been rigorously evaluated for reliability and validity, rather than you going to the effort to do that yourself. Of course, that is not always possible. In Chapter 10, we are moving away from abstract discussions of research instruments construction to more practical guidelines. How do we ask questions? What should questionnaires look like? What is the best way to construct research instruments that measure very complex concepts, and therefore we need a composite of different instruments? We take a look at some common research questionnaire tools such as the Likert scale and talk about qualitative questionnaire development. Slide 3. Open-ended questions can be used in interview schedules and in self-administered questionnaires, but more frequently on interview schedules because of the opportunity to probe for more information. It is important to remember that closed-ended questions need to be exhaustive and mutually exclusive. Slide 4. Clear items. When we say we should ask clear items, most of it would think that is a given. However, what is clear to us may not be clear to our respondents. It can range from the silly, such as the time somebody printed out a bunch of RSVPs for a party and neglected to let people know when and where the party was. We make those kind of mistakes in research, and we assume that people are going to know what we're talking about simply because we know. Further, we need to be sure that we don't write like we often speak. When we are in conversation with another person, we rely an awful lot on context and the knowledge that when the other person is confused about our meaning, they will either tell us or we will see the expression on their face and understand that they are not following our line of reasoning. We don't have such luxury in written survey instruments. People have to rely on the written word, and they rely on it as it is written. In the example in this slide, should the state abandon its community-based services and spend the money on improving institutional care, the second part of that question assumes agreement with the first part. People would often expect an answer for this kind of question to be yes or no. However, one in agreement that the state should abandon its community-based services, but then not agree that they should spend the money on improving institutional care. Further, they may be in disagreement about abandoning the community-based services and believe the state to spend more money on improving institutional care. Of course, if you are asking someone who is not familiar with community-based services or institutional care, then they may not be competent to answer. You may have to provide them with some information in order to make them competent. Slide 5. Having respondents who are freely willing to answer your question goes to the heart of research ethics and compliance with research laws. Beyond simple compliance, though, we can't get a research project off the ground if we don't have willing participants. When we think of willing, we need to include any barriers that we as researchers put in the way of collecting information. When we recruit people and ask questions that are not relevant to the study, they tend to not want to answer. Similarly, if we overload participants with long, complex questions requiring convoluted answers, then they are likely to drop out as well. Sixth slide. Using negations in our research protocols can sometimes be problematic. We do this for reasons of understandability. The introduction of the word not is often overlooked when people hastily read items. Also, negations are sometimes associated with trick questions. When you are taking exams and quizzes, and especially when you're taking your licensure exam, paying careful attention to any question that contains the word not, no, or never. Additionally, negations are treated differently from people who are from different cultures. So even though, for example, my father, who spoke Lakota as his first language, after he had learned English real good, as he would say, he would consistently and throughout his life never stop using double negations. Whereas in English, the sentence in an English sentence or questions such as, "Are you not hungry?" he would answer, "No," meaning that he was not hungry. Whereas English speakers would be confused by such a question and say, "Yes, I am not hungry," when asked such a question. Of course, we want to avoid biased terms or biased constructions of our questions or questionnaire. For example, when we ask questions like, "How many hours a day does the mother in the family cook?" when our research on familial duties, here we would be conforming to a stereotype that it is the mother in the family who cooks, or that there is even a mother in the home, or that anybody in the home cooks. And being culturally sensitive does not simply mean avoiding the N word or referring to Native Americans as chiefs or redskins. We actually get into more problems with our research questionnaire construction when we fail to take other cultures' worldview into consideration. And cultures mean a lot more than race or ethnicity. There is a worldview that exists in people of higher wealth than those in poverty, regardless of their race or ethnicity. There are professional cultures, rural and urban cultures, cultures based on age, etc. Now some question, slide 7. Some of the nuts and bolts of questionnaire construction have nothing to do at all with cultural sensitivity or the use of jargon language, but have to do with where we place things on our research instruments. We want our research instruments to be orderly, with enough space that we can allow that participants will be able to differentiate between different questions. Further, when we ask someone to place a check in the box, we need to put a box there for them to check, and not simply rely on them to put a check on the item number or letter. When we say box, use a box, not a circle. If all that we have on word processing machines is circles, then we should ask them to fill in the circle. Now, contingency questions. Those are used when we want to shorten surveys by only asking relevant questions. So, for example, if someone says no to question, "Have you ever drank alcohol?" then you don't want them to go to a series of questions describing the level of their drinking or how long it has been since they drank, etc. You want them to skip on to the next topic. This can be problematic if we are not careful about the language we use on our questionnaires. For example, in the 7th edition of Rubin and Babby, we have a contingency question that asks the question, have you ever smoked marijuana? And then there is an arrow that leads down from yes for them to answer a series of other possibilities. Now that works just fine when everything is visible. The person can see that it is a contingency question. However, with technology and online survey research, quite often you will just be taken to the next question. So for example, if you answered no to the marijuana question, many of the next question may ask you about cocaine use. If you answered yes, the question on frequency would then show up, probably followed by a question about cocaine use. While the term smoked marijuana can mean different things to different people, some people might view it as, have you ever had the habit of smoking marijuana? Versus, what you want to know is, have they ever tried marijuana? Most, of course, you want to differentiate between recreational use of marijuana by smoking or recreational use of marijuana by ingestion, in which case you might want to ask, have you ever tried smoking marijuana, even just once? Of course, being clear like this has implications for clinical practice as well. When we asked questions such as the smoke questions, what do you smoke, we can get nonsensical answers like yeah, do you smoke? Like, yes, I smoke pork shoulders or baby back ribs. It is important where in the questionnaire you ask questions. One, you don't want to launch into a sensitive information so quickly that it is startling to your respondents. On the other hand, you don't want to put off critical information too long because respondents may get overly bored or disinterested if you spend too much time asking about demographics and those sorts of things. So much of it depends on your topic. If you want individuals to get into the habit of answering your questions, start with just a few easy to answer questions such as demographics. How long have you been employed here? What is your experience with the new parking system, etc. Use easy, non-threatening questions to socialize your respondents to the question and answer process. When we find that space is a premium on our research instruments, we can use tables to help create order out of our questionnaires. Here is an example of a Likert scale being used on repeated questions, thus saving repeated use of either instructions or blank space. The boxes serve to keep the respondent organized. Including instructions in your questionnaire. I can't overemphasize this enough. Don't make assumptions that your respondents will be able to understand how they're supposed to answer things, even if it is crystal clear to you. Constructing composite majors. Some variables are very complex and multifaceted, too much so to be measured using only one question. Recall our select discussion from the previous chapter on complexity. I like to use the example of religiousness. We can ask about religious attendance, but that does not really get at the concept of religiousness. Neither does simple questions like religious importance. While it is simple to ask a question like, how important is religious activity in your life, you're likely to get an answer based on some social desirability bias. Oh, the person thinks, I'll bet this researcher thinks it is important that people are religious, so I will say that it is very important to me. Rather than rely on an individual's reaction to your question, you can build a set of questions that get at various complex dynamics that go into a concept and you will be able to measure it all the better. While missing data is often thought of as an analysis problem, it is important to think about during the questionnaire development phase. You may sometimes have grounds for treating missing data as one available response. For example, if a questionnaire asked respondents to indicate their participation in a number of activities by checking yes or no for each, many respondents may have checked some activities yes and left the remainder blank. In such a case, you might decide that a failure meant no and score missing data in this case as though the respondents had checked the no space. Now, it would be important to report that in your final report. There are many approaches that may be used to address missing data. Deciding on the correct one depends on the amount of missing data, level of measurement, and other considerations. Likert scaling. While historically the Likert scale, or Likert scale, has been used on a range of strongly agree to strongly disagree and included 4 items. Some researchers dislike the absence of a neutral response or an ambivalent response, or an opportunity for individuals to check not applicable. Be sure when constructing Likert scales that your adjectives and verbs matched with the subject matter. Don't use agree and disagree when you are interested in measuring a degree of difficulty, for example, in which case you might say very difficult or difficult and easy or very easy. So be cognizant of that. The Likert style question can be adapted to tables that gather information about complex topics. For example, this slide contains a table that would probably be preceded by a question, such as, give your opinion on the new agency treatment manual, for example. So in this case, the person could rate it as being either very much simple or very much complex, very much useful to very much useless. So that would be the way to use that when you have a number of questions on one theme. Qualitative measures. Qualitative interview guides can range from very unstructured and informal conversational interviews sometimes happen where the interviewer has little or no preconceived notion of the topical areas they will discuss. Sometimes they're highly structured and standardized interviews designed to be used on multiple subjects or by multiple interviewers. Sometimes qualitative measures are constructed in such a way that they're easily coded for quantitative analysis. So my closing comments would be, don't take the construction of your instruments lightly. Never, I'd say never, put a questionnaire into use without having tested it first by running it across some colleagues, or better yet, having someone who is within the class of person that you're researching look it over first. So that's all for today. Maybe I'll stop this.